Welcome back to Session 3 of our Spring Faith Group series, Solomon, a Man Lured Away from God's Own Heart. Without question, King Solomon's best-known legacy is building the temple in Jerusalem. By all accounts, it was a glorious, beautiful structure. It was patterned after the tabernacle that was built and carried through the wilderness. In fact, it was an exact replica of the tabernacle, except twice as large. Now, back in Exodus, the book devotes 7 chapters to God giving the plans for the tabernacle to Moses. And then another 6 chapters describing how the builders followed the plans to create it. Clearly, the tabernacle was really important. But oddly, the tabernacle disappears once Israel enters the promised land. Thereafter, all we hear about is the ark of God that sat in the Holy of Holies. But all the rest of it, you never hear another word about. So when Solomon built the temple, it restored a proper home for the ark of God, and once again gave Israel a place to make sacrifices to God, rather than the shrines and the high places. Well, 1 Kings uses 2 long chapters to describe the temple and everything in it. Now, some of the terms in there, the descriptive terms, have become obscure. We're not entirely sure what every last word means, but it was clearly a magnificent building that used the best materials, the most exquisite decor. Then the dedication of the temple is described in chapter 8. Again, a very long chapter. As Solomon dedicated the temple, it says that he sacrificed 22,000 oxen and 120,000 sheep, which are just absurd totals. I mean, that's seriously over the top. But most of the dedication in chapter 8 of 1 Kings is devoted to a long prayer that King Solomon prayed in the hearing of the people as he dedicated the temple. He acknowledges there that God cannot be contained in a building, but he prays that God will look toward the temple, keep his eye on it day and night going forward. And he asks God to forgive and restore and preserve the people of Israel through the temple as they worship the Lord there. Well, crucially, 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10 reports that God honored and accepted the temple. When the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord. So the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Well, as you recall, a pillar of cloud is one of the ways God led the people through the wilderness. And when God was present on Mount Sinai, a cloud would come down over the mountain. Moses would enter up into it. So this cloud filling the temple is a sign that God has taken up dwelling there. His presence is in the temple. But once again, Israel clearly stated that God himself could not be contained, nowhere near. And so this presence of God is sometimes said that it's God's glory, or Shekinah, that dwelt there. At other places, they talk about God's name dwelling there. However this is understood, the point is that God has approved of the temple, is present there with his power in some way to bless the people. Well, from that time forward, the temple was central to Israel's whole identity. It was revered by the Israelites as the assurance of God's presence among them. And we hear the joy that they found in the temple. Psalm 122:1 famously reads, "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go up to the house of the Lord.'" Or Psalm 27, verse 4 says, "One thing I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. The temple also became the only place to make sacrifice. And it was the sacrifices that really maintained Israelites' right relationship with God. The Jewish festivals in the annual calendar all revolved around the temple and what occurred there. In the New Testament, in Luke 2, Mary and Joseph had gone to the temple to make sacrifices when they encountered the prophets Simeon and Anna. Well, still today, we Christians love our church buildings. We become deeply attached to them, as I know many people are deeply attached to this room. Even so, I think it's really hard for us to comprehend how dominant a role the temple played, how immense its status was among the people of Israel. And so the Jewish people were just devastated, utterly, when Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple in 587 BC. When they were released from exile about 50 years later, rebuilding a temple was a challenging but essential task. And although that temple was not nearly as ornate as Solomon's, still the people rejoiced to have that place back in Jerusalem. The fear that the Roman Empire would come in and destroy that second temple, which had since been completely remodeled by King Herod, that fear was one of the driving motivations behind Jesus' crucifixion. The chief priests were afraid that he was going to lead a rebellion, the Romans would crush it, and the temple would be destroyed. And when that very thing happened in 70 AD, the Romans came in and destroyed the temple. Sacrifice ended in Judaism because that one place now was gone. And yet still among some of the most Orthodox Jews, there is a deep, abiding hope that a third temple will be rebuilt and sacrifice can resume. Well, given all that and more that testifies to this central, essential role of the Jerusalem temple in Israel's faith, the Bible gives a strangely mixed and ambivalent witness to the temple. It starts actually in 2 Samuel 7, where David had the idea that he would build a temple for God, and God shut him down instantly. I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. But I've been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. Wherever I have moved about among all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, saying, "Why have you not built me a house of cedar?" Now, in that same conversation with David, God did admit that David's son would one day build a temple. But you have to wonder, based on this reaction, if God really needed or even ever wanted a temple. Secondly, the temple was gorgeous, but it may not, in fact, have been Solomon's priority. He spent more time, very possibly more money, building all of his palaces. And there's a solid chance that the temple was built into that palace complex, so that it was really more of a royal chapel than, say, a national church. Beyond that, in 1 Kings 9, right after the dedication of the temple, God sounds a bit unsure about the whole project that Solomon has done. He did, as we note, enter the temple and promise to honor it. I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you made before me. I've consecrated this house that you have built and put my name there forever. My eyes and heart will be there for all time. So clearly it's not that God was offended or somehow ticked off by the building of the temple. But he followed that immediately with a sharp and maybe prescient warning to Solomon. As for you, if you will walk before me as David your father walked, with integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I have commanded you, then I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. But if you turn aside from following me, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut Israel off from the land that I have given them. And the house that I have consecrated for my name, I will cast out of my sight, and the house will become a heap of ruins. Notice again the if-then conditions that God puts on his acceptance of the temple. In particularly, he warned Solomon that the building of the temple did not somehow put God at Israel's beck and call. God of Israel could not be bribed or manipulated or obligated the way that the gods of the pagans supposedly could be. And then that warning is followed directly by a report of some really bad decisions by Solomon. So overall, the situation, even as the temple has been dedicated and everyone's rejoicing in it, doesn't seem very promising. And God appears surprisingly ambivalent about the whole project. But beyond that, several of the prophets of Israel later expressed really negative attitudes toward the temple and its rituals. In Amos 5, God raged, I despise your festivals and take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Now, to be clear, that was directed against the worship site at Bethel, in what was now the northern kingdom of Israel, not the temple in Jerusalem. But still, it's a remarkably negative reaction from God to Israel's worship life. Later on in Jeremiah 7, God accuses Israel of trying to use the temple to manipulate him. He says, will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods you haven't known? And then come stand before me in this house, the temple, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations? I mean, the short version of that is, do I have stupid written on my forehead? Temple doesn't work that way, and you can't manipulate me through it. The temple had become counterproductive to true faith and worship in Judah. Around the same time as Jeremiah, Micah 6 quotes the people responding sort of in a whining, resentful tone to God because he never seems to be satisfied with what they offer him. With what shall I come before the Lord? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? With calves a year old, which is a very valuable animal? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn child for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Point being that no matter what we do, God's never happy. He just keeps criticizing us. But Micah responds to that whine by rejecting the value of sacrifice. He has told you what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Here too, the rituals of the temple and the sacrifices of the people appear to be an obstacle to genuine faith. And most significantly, in the Gospels, Jesus confirmed, in some ways, the prophet's rejection of the temple. We all know the famous episode of his cleansing the temple, but as he turned the animals loose and overturned the money changers' tables, what that implied was, you don't need any animals for sacrifice anymore. I have come to be the once-for-all sacrifice. That isn't necessary. And in John 2, as he cleanses the temple, he declares, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now John steps in to explain, he was speaking of the temple of his body. But that, again, simply means that Jesus replaced the temple with himself. That this was not the center of God's connection to his people anymore. And so, as with every element of Solomon's reign, we're left here with a pretty ambivalent attitude toward what is in some ways his greatest work, the temple in Jerusalem. And that ambivalent attitude becomes all the more important given the central, essential role the temple played in Israel's faith and identity. Now, as Christians, of course, we view worship differently, but this mixed witness still poses issues of how we view and treasure and use or misuse our beloved church buildings. How do they aid faith? In what ways can they become obstacles to faith? Well, now enjoy some discussions around those and other questions in your faith groups, and we'll look forward to seeing you for session 4.